I have to confess, I am a semi-gator. Having gone to the University of Florida twice, I'll admit that. Before beginning, I want to thank members of the Aucilla Research Institute, sponsors and volunteers who are making this conference possible. I also want to remember Dr. Ann Holt, whose leadership and enthusiasm for this conference really made it possible at the outset. And my thanks to all of you, Jana, Jack, and Jim, the three J's. Good. So my task in this presentation is to cover the approximately 176 years of contact between Spaniards and the Apalachees, basically in Northwest Florida, from conquest to conversion. I also realize that given the timing of this talk, I am what stands between you and happy hour and conversations among friends new and old. So with that in mind, I believe it's important, first of all, to consider what we call conquest. It's a term that generally implies a military overthrow of an area and submission of its inhabitants to a new ruler. Conquest implies control of territory and people, and that is certainly what happened in many parts of the New World. The early forays made by Spaniards in this, however, were more in the nature of explorations. There was no submission of native peoples, no control of territory, no establishment of a colony or continued presence. In truth, there was armed resistance by the Apalachees that led to retreat and withdrawal of Spaniards. The early Spaniards, and they would have called themselves Christians, were mobile explorers following rumors of wealth. They often found themselves in dire straits as native peoples resisted their demands for food, their theft and destruction of property, and the Spaniards kidnapping their leaders. These explorers cut a swath through parts of the southeast that was neither glorious nor easy. Many died, many fewer returned to their places of origin. For a society based on warfare, the warfare that had finally won the Hispanic factions their liberations from the last of their Muslim overlords in 1491, the exploration of the North American continent would not equal the glories of campaigns against the Aztec or Inca, as well as the wealth that was gained. These true conquests produced the plunder that created the wealth of the Spanish crown, the wealth of many Spanish families, new status won by second and third sons precluded from inheritance by their birth order, and the foundations of an overseas colonial empire. Conquest, when it came in Florida, was not a glorious campaign against native factions. It was an incremental spread from a small beachhead on the East Coast at St. Augustine, a place deemed temporary while the French threat at Jacksonville was removed. When the push into the interior came, it was led by religious missionaries, principally of the Franciscan order. Today, the year 1492 is significant because of the voyage that opened the Western Hemisphere to exploration, conquest, colonization, exploitation, and untold wealth for many European nations, beginning with Spain and Portugal, but including England, France, Russia, the Netherlands, and Denmark. But the year 1492 was significant in the history of the Spains, as the modern Spanish nation was known then. Composed of various entities, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and others, the citizens of what would become the modern nation-state had been fighting to repel Moorish overlords for some 700 years. The wars against the Moors crafted a militant society, one in which warfare had been endemic and military skills highly valued. Isabel and Ferdinand announced a combined rule of their holdings in 1479 and led the final campaigns against the Moors. In January of 1492, the Catholic monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand, took possession of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold. The long effort had ended, but the society it had created was one organized for warfare, both secular and religious. Imagine an America where everyone belongs to the same church, where one's religious affiliation is the same, where piety is rewarded socially, where honor, military skill, and religious heritage are fundamental are fundamental to personal and national identity. That was the social environment of the Spains in 1492. To reinforce that identity and Hispanic identity, non-Spaniards and non-Catholics were banished or forced to convert. The Holy Office of the Inquisition, established in 1478, treated harshly with conversos. These are Jews or Muslims who privately continued to worship. After centuries of fighting for freedom from Muslim overlords, creating an Hispanic identity as defender of the Roman Catholic faith was a hallmark of Spanish national character. It is said to understand the treatment of native peoples in the Americas, one need look no farther than the conquest of the Canary Islands. Between 1404 and 1496, European adventurers, principally Castilians, subdued the native populations of these islands, collectively known to them as the Guanches. The story is a familiar one in that the Guanches lost their land to the invaders, fought wars of resistance and ultimately lost, and died in large numbers from epidemic diseases. The final Guanche leader was offered peace if he accepted the authority of the Catholic monarchs. His refusal led to the final battles with the Castilians and the loss of Guanche autonomy on any of the islands. As New World lands and peoples became known to Spaniards, exploration and conquest used many of the same tactics and strategies applied successfully in the Canaries. In the Americas, the first area of Spanish intrusion was the Caribbean. The island of Hispaniola, one of the greater Antilles, became the base of exploration and conquest. In what is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Spaniards fought the native peoples, expropriated their lands, and set up commercial endeavors exploiting native labor. The people and their land were conferred to one conquistador or another as the seigneurial society of Iberia was transplanted to the New World through the system of encomienda. This system provided a veneer of respectability in which the Spanish overlords were officially made responsible for the well-being and religious instruction of their native charges. But labor was the primary need of the encomendero and the primary role of native peoples. If native populations were not situated optimally for Spanish needs, the policy of congregación was imposed, forcing natives from their homes to settlements in more favorable locations. After removal, the Spaniards burned their homes to prevent their return, and this permitted colonists to claim vacant lands for their own use. The treatment of native peoples under this system was lethal for many, and a serious concern of clerics, encomenderos, and crown officials, particularly as populations dwindled. The Spaniards viewed their invasion as conquest, and the natives as conquered pagan peoples. Their otherness in dress, bodily appearance, and behaviors reinforced their treatment as subservient and fit only to labor. Repartimiento, a system of labor levies required of native groups, provided the workers for a variety of Spanish commercial enterprises. Gold mining was the initial pursuit, but once the mine played out, farming was the fallback. Indigenous Tainos provided most of the laborers, but as their numbers dwindled, raiding for slaves became a profitable endeavor for Spanish entrepreneurs throughout the Caribbean and on the mainlands. Island Caribs, who were fiercely resistant to the Spaniards, were captured in the Lesser Antilles, and African slaves were brought to Hispaniola as well to replace the native population. The first widespread epidemic on Hispaniola was recorded in 1519. An epidemic disease, coupled with brutal labor practices and social disruption, resulted in the demise of most of the indigenous population of Hispaniola by the 1520s. And it led to the increased importation of Bahamian natives, island Caribs, and African slaves. It is possible that slave raiders also reached the peninsula that would become known as La Florida in the 16th century, quite early, but there is no direct evidence. Native peoples met by Ponce de Leon in 1513 were hostile, but in 1521 they were violently resistant, perhaps as a result of coastal slave trades. By the time of the Narvaez expedition in 1528, Spaniards had experienced almost 80 years of contact with native cultures of the New World, which they found to lack the kinds of social development that to Spaniards equated with continental European accomplishments or civilization. Their social habits and customs, their apparent idleness and inattention to instructions regarding things that mattered to Spaniards convinced the conquerors of various regions that the native peoples were fit for little but a subservient life. Although Crown policies, the official policies, directed humane treatment of native peoples, proclamations and laws were liberally ignored by Spaniards in the New World. There was more concern for preserving Spanish control of Indians through social and economic arrangements than their protection from compulsory labor, ill treatment, and forced resettlement. There was concern in Spain among clerics and jurists about the nature and treatment of New World peoples. The question initially asked after 1492, are they human, transformed into what is the nature of their humanity? If they were pagans, as all were by definition, were they capable of salvation or incapable of making a true conversion? If the latter, they fell into the category of natural slaves, as Roman Catholic theology had taught since the time of Thomas Aquinas, and could be legally enslaved. But Dominican cleric Bartolomé de las Casas, the defender of the Indians, had firsthand experience of New World peoples and believed that the Indians were capable of being brought into the church. He proposed that they were natural children, not natural slaves, and argued their cause before the crown. This distinction supposedly made enslavement unlawful, but trade in native slaves continued to be a lucrative practice in many Spanish colonies. More importantly, the distinction also reinforced a perspective of indigenous people that further diminished them in the eyes of Spaniards. Natives were expendable. Before the arrival of the Spaniards, there is no evidence of an inherent incompatibility of native cultures with their land, their subsistence needs, or their ideological practices. There is evidence of adaptation as circumstances changed through time. Settled agriculture succeeded nomadic hunting and gathering in some areas. Stylistic changes occurred in material culture, and some regions were abandoned or supported smaller or larger populations in response to changing climatic and environmental conditions. There had been intergroup competition and changes in subsistence practices that in some areas led to an increased social complexity. New World peoples, just as Europeans, had experienced the gamut of natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, tornadoes, hurricanes, and remained on the landscape. They suffered loss of lives, destruction of settlements, and threats to subsistence from warfare, just as Europeans had. But native New World people were evaluated by Europeans not on the basis of what they had, but what they did not have. Literacy, a European lifestyle, domesticated animals, codified systems of laws, and technology effective against European military arms and tactics. Measured by the European eye, the native peoples of North America were hostile pagans who had a low level of cultural development and who should be brought to salvation and civilized behavior. Thus, a childlike status was attributed to people who had for millennia lived their lives under their own laws and customs, who had adapted many plants, a few animals, and in some cases the very land to their subsistence needs, whose worldview, ideology, and languages had been sufficient for cultural transmission through countless generations across the extensive landscape of the New World and among varied populations. To characterize them as natural children promoted a view of indigenous people that consigned them to a status that made them prey to patriarchal treatment, enslavement, servitude, dispossession, forced resettlement, and subject to cultural anomie. Indigenous people were seen as fit only to labor in the mines, on the farms, and in the households of the Spaniards. As laborers, their value was commercial, and their lives were relatively insignificant since their numbers were plentiful at first. In what is today the southeastern United States, the last dominant prehistoric culture is called Mississippian because evidence of its greatest development lies within the Mississippi alluvial valley. Mississippian culture is characterized by mound centers, large sedentary populations supported by maize agriculture, hierarchical social and political ranking, shared iconography with regional variations, and long-distance trade networks. In this area, the best example of Mississippian culture is the Lake Jackson site north of Tallahassee. Most archaeologists consider Mississippian societies to have achieved social development consistent with a complex chiefdom. Some have argued primitive states. The prehistoric people of northwest Florida, likely the antecedents of the Apalachees, evidence a Mississippian lifeway. We are left to wonder what cultural developments might have occurred in the Southeast given the highly organized societies to the south, southwest, and even in the Caribbean. The arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century, the brutality of the entradas, the disruption of social life, and the introduction of epidemic diseases ended purely indigenous cultural development. After the first entradas, southeastern native societies were directly or indirectly affected by European contact. The earliest narrative discussion of the landscapes of our area was written by the explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, one of 4 known survivors of the expedition led by Pánfilo de Narváez in 1528. Before arriving in Apalachee, he observed that the land was relatively flat. Not so in Apalachee. In Apalachee, there were extensive maize fields, and the houses were scattered about the countryside. He commented that the native houses were built of grass and located in protected places because of the great storms that commonly occurred in the area. He observed deer, rabbits, bears, panthers, possums. It is possible that areas he considered good for grazing cattle were fallowed maize fields. He mentions flocks of geese and ducks, wading birds, quail, and hawks. Cabeza de Vaca remarked the thick woods, the great groves of trees, and many lagoons of Apalachee. He complained that there were many large and fallen trees which impeded their passage both on the land and in the river crossings. Also posing considerable difficulty were the defenders of this landscape, the people they would call Apalachees. When Narváez and company entered Apalachee after crossing the Aucilla River, they made their way to the first town, Ivarichuco. As they found it undefended because the men were away hunting, they installed themselves in the village and confiscated the food they found. When the men returned, they requested the Spaniards leave, but were refused. Next day, the Apalachees burned the village and continued to harass the Spaniards. The lack of gold or other precious metals or stone and the constant harassment by the Apalachees induced Narváez to opt to leave the area. He moved his force south toward the coast, on the way raiding the village of Ayute for food. I would like to point out that the first recorded epidemic on the North American continent is recorded for Europeans, the members of this expedition. Many, including Narváez, fell ill of what seems to have been a severe gastrointestinal illness. At the coastal encampment, 40 men died. A further 10 were killed by Apalachees as they foraged in sight of the Spanish encampment. Narváez recovered, but the expedition was in disarray. After a near mutiny of the mounted horsemen was quelled, all threw their lot in with the decision to construct vessels and make for the Spanish colony at Tampico on the Mexican coast. The 40 remaining horses became food to maintain the Spaniards. The equestrian hardware became the raw material for fittings used to construct the vessels, and their clothing, the sails. I would be remiss not to mention that the Apalachees continued to harass the Spaniards on their journey to the coast and when they tried to forage away from their encampment. Of the original 300 plus who began the trek north toward Apalachee, only 242 set sail from the coastal encampment. 11 years later, Hernando de Soto led an even larger expedition which would travel amidst a number of the states that now compose the American Southeast. De Soto debarked with a force of 600 men. We don't know how many others. He was aware of the food constraints faced by the Narváez expedition and brought a herd of 200 pigs. He brought more horses and led a more mobile force. He also had the service of a Spaniard named Juan Ortiz, who had been shipwrecked while in search of the Narváez expedition. Ortiz had lived among Timucua speakers and was able to translate for the Spaniards until reaching Apalachee. As the winter months were expected to be challenging, De Soto chose an overwintering location in and around the town of Anhaica, now identified as the Martin De Soto site in Tallahassee. He would remain almost 6 months, during which the resistance and harassment of the Apalachees was a constant threat. Believing that gold was to be found in the east, his route out of Apalachee took him northeast into Georgia. The expeditions mounted by Narváez in 28 and De Soto in 39, proceeded north on the western side of the peninsula using tactics of seizure of leaders, guides, burden bearers, and foodstuffs, as well as using firearms, edged weapons, and fearsome hunting dogs against native resistance. Both expeditions were met with strong resistance by the Apalachees. Their hostility to Spanish presence is likely the reason that the area was not deemed of immediate interest to Spanish plans for Florida. Instead, a colony established by French Huguenots on the northeast coast of Florida in 1562 challenged Spanish claims on the North American continent and threatened the safe passage of the Plate Fleet sailing from South America and the flow of wealth to Spain. These problems became the focus of Crown concern and led to the appointment of Pedro Menendez de Aviles as governor of Florida. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, became the stage for the brutal elimination of the colony of French Protestants. Menendez then established his capital at Santa Elena near present-day Beaufort, South Carolina, but it was abandoned in 1587. St. Augustine endured as a claimant Spanish colony and military outpost for protection of the Bahama Channel and the Gulf Stream route, the primary northerly route of the returning Plate Fleet. When Menendez accepted the position of governor of Florida, encomienda was expressly forbidden, but the needs of Spanish colonists for labor and goods had to be met in other ways. As conquered people, native peoples owed tribute. Food and labor were significant elements of expected tribute, but other goods such as maize flour, hides, furs, and tallow also were important. Repartimiento provided workers for various building projects in St. Augustine and elsewhere, as well as tilling and planting fields to support the garrison. This arrangement, made through native chiefs, was not outright slavery, as laborers were to be paid for their work, but payment was usually made in European-produced items of little value. Repartimiento resulted in heavy labor assignments, usually at a distance, disruption of family life by removing adult males, greater physical labor for women in their agricultural fields of their settlements, greater exposure to epidemic disease through movement of laborers, death from labor requirements such as long distance, burdening, and broken promises for payment and subsistence support for native laborers in St. Augustine. Additionally, the onerous levies weakened the authority of chiefs. Menendez first enlisted Jesuit missioners to work among the native peoples of Florida. Principally located in South and Southwest Florida, the Jesuits were unsuccessful in making native conversions. They withdrew from the Florida mission field in 1572 after the massacre of 8 of their number in the Chesapeake area. Franciscans were sent in replacement and worked primarily in the St. Augustine area until the 1590s, when missions were established in northeast Florida and on the Georgia Sea Islands. The mission period in Apalachee, today's Jefferson and Leon counties, began in 1633 and ended precipitously in 1704. Attempts to reestablish missions in this area after that time were brief and unsuccessful. At the height of mission activity, there were at least 14 named missions and numerous dependent visitas for which the friar was responsible. Extension of the mission field to Apalachee was a result of meetings with Franciscans working in adjacent Ustoga province, beginning in 1608. But 25 years passed before the principals in St. Augustine thought that the Apalachee homelands were safe enough. In the first 2 years of missionization, 7 or 8 missions were founded. Although the paramount chief of Apalachee was resident in the village of Ivatachuco, the Franciscans made Anhaica their base of operations. Native chiefs were maintained as leaders of their villages, and the friar became a new leader. The friar was responsible for his congregation, for maintaining strong, positive relationships with the local chiefs, and representing the crown to the Apalachees and the Apalachees to the crown. Beside this dual representation, there also was a matter of introducing and enforcing cultural change, including religious change, of course, but also economic engagement with the Spaniards and behavioral changes in dress, social interaction, and marriage rules. Another factor that is clear in retrospect is that the increased proximity to Europeans and African-derived people accelerated population loss from epidemic disease. Marrinan has basically documented the demise of the Timucua, Mocama, and Wally peoples of northeast Florida and southeast Georgia. After 1565, direct contact between Spaniards and these groups was more frequent and population decline more obvious. Native populations numbers are not known because the manner in which the first contact occurred, whether entrada or colonial settlement, was not conducive to accurate estimates of populations encountered nor to census taking among indigenous groups. Left alone for almost a century after De Soto's expedition passed through their homelands, the Apalachees at the outset of missionization were a populous group estimated at around 30 to 36,000 in 1608. During the 71 years that Apalachee missions endured, that number would drop precipitously, particularly after 1670 and the founding of the English Charlestown colony in what is today South Carolina. Armed conflict between English and Spanish forces required greater labor expenditures to secure St. Augustine against attack. More Spaniards were resettled to Apalachee province, and more Apalachees were sent to the town as laborers and militiamen. Greater interaction and movement spread epidemic disease. Slave raiding by native groups, allied with the English, targeted mission congregations in Spanish Florida, and this threat grew in intensity in the late 17th century. The number of Spanish colonists resident in Apalachee province grew, most living in the vicinity of the principal mission, San Luis de Talimali. These Spanish families usurped the usual trade in foodstuffs that the Apalachees had depended on. They granted themselves land and established ranches that directly competed with Apalachee production, and they expected the Apalachees to be servants in their homes and on their farms. The repartimiento levies became ever more onerous, particularly the requirement to carry burdens of foodstuffs to St. Augustine, a 2-week walk one way. Chiefs lost prestige from their association with the labor levies. By the late 17th century, San Luis was a Spanish village. The Apalachees had withdrawn to the forest a league distant. Insults and abuses festered when raids by Apalachicola warriors allied with Carolina militiamen began in 1702. Social and political instability threatened the solidarity of the Apalachee missions. Some chiefs argued for leaving the Spaniards and trusting to the English. That decision might mean being sold into slavery on a Caribbean plantation or resettlement in Georgia. Some fled to Creek relatives in eastern Alabama, but others remained loyal to the Spaniards and followed them to St. Augustine. Loyalty gained them death in subsequent raids. How do we measure conversion? We cannot know what is in someone's heart and mind, but we have insights from the San Luis faction that fled west, first to Pensacola and then to the French at Mobile. The French settled them on lands, among other displaced groups that came to be known as the Petites Nations. The French remarked their skills in woodworking and farming. They dressed in European fashion, and more importantly, they requested a priest to minister to them. The French received them as good Catholics, but found their Spanish and Apalachee languages objectionable. A group that had survived among the Creeks returned to the Pensacola area in the 18th century and also requested priests. 40 families from this group were removed to Veracruz, Mexico in 1763 at the end of the first Spanish period when Great Britain acquired Florida. The populations of both groups were severely reduced by epidemic disease and the cruelty of a displaced life. The ever-changing international relationships among Spain, France, Great Britain, and the emergent United States imposed further displacement. Various treaties moved them into other locations, or in the case of the Louisiana Apalachees, into hiding for almost a century. It seems to me that the Apalachees were converted into Spanish peasantry during their 71 years of mission life. They gave their loyalty to Spanish authorities who ultimately looked to protect their own and abandoned them. They suffered from international tensions and old antipathies among the warring nations of Europe who had gained hegemony in the Southeast. Decisions made by men unknown to them in faraway places determined how the Southeast would be settled. The Apalachees and many other indigenous people would simply be swept aside. Thank you.